It is late on a Friday afternoon, actually a little bit after 3, but I did want to have my coffee talk, and so I am asking the question or discussing the topic of taking ownership this week. What is taking ownership? Is it even a good thing? How do you do it? Let's talk about it. All right, so with taking ownership, I have to tell you the whole story. First, I'm drinking coffee, and yes, it is still caffeinated coffee. Um, I usually don't try to drink. I try not to drink caffeine after 3 o'clock, but it's still before 3, so I'm having some caffeinated coffee from Storyville, and I ground it with my new burr grinder from the Mason Jar Lifestyle, I believe is what it's called, and so it actually is more consistent in how it grinds the coffee, and it actually can impact each of my different ways of making coffee. It can change how it tastes depending on how big the coffee the grounds are versus not. So it's been interesting. I've been having fun with it this past week and a half since I bought it, maybe 2 weeks, just exploring. So I'm here talking about coffee, but I really want to talk about taking ownership. So here's how the whole thing gets to this point. On Saturday mornings, I meet with a bunch of guys and we eat breakfast together. So you could call us a Saturday morning breakfast club, but we usually call ourselves Cars and Coffee. At different points in the 6 years that we've been meeting, we've done some Bible studies together, but in general, we just like to gather to catch up on each other's lives, what's going on, and then we'll pray for each other. So we'll usually spend an hour to 2 hours just catching up and eating together, drinking coffee, talking. If someone brought a new vehicle, we'd go out in the parking lot, look at their new vehicle, and we just spend some time together talking about our cars. And by the way, when our group buys a new vehicle, it's not anywhere close to new. You have to think something, it's not new. It's usually something different. So, good afternoon, Daniel. And just quick, my setup in my office has changed slightly. I have a roll top desk over here in the corner now that I got uh, from my friend the Chartiers. When Senior Bob passed away, I got that with the desk that he had, so I have it in my office at the moment. And I like it because I can close the lid and you can't see the mess that I have inside there. So I have a lot of my writing and studying materials are over in that corner now, and I absolutely am loving it. So the that's the change in the room, and so I'm still fighting the desk here. I want the space that you can't see here. It's an L shape, and this is where I'm supposed to be editing, and I wanted to keep it down to just plain editing and a few other technical things, and get rid of any of the residual piles of either technology or papers. And so, like, I have this is happening to me. I'm going through all of my old hard drives, and making sure that I didn't lose something somewhere on a hard drive and never try to capture it again. So anyway, I'm doing that kind of stuff. But the whole point what I wanted to talk about was taking ownership. So Saturday mornings we get together, and sometime in the past year, maybe year and a half, the term extreme ownership has started being tossed around by the young guys at our Saturday morning Cars and Coffee. And as we're talking about extreme ownership, the name Jocko Willink comes up. He was Navy SEAL. He now runs a business where he helps corporations actually gain cohesiveness and direction and find out what their problems are and help them with decision making. Anyway, he has this whole other career now that he's finished with the Navy SEALs. And so after a while, just because the young men at the Saturday Morning Cars and Coffee keep talking about this guy, I, out of self-defense, had to listen to a few of his podcasts, and some of them can be as long as 5 hours because he'll bring in someone and interview them and it'll go on, hear their whole life story, right? And so I was just listening to him, and so he has a few concepts that I thought were very fascinating. See, we live in a time frame in America where the general pool of public knowledge has really grown in a lot of areas. So for instance, one area that we've really grown a lot of knowledge in is we are aware that my family of origin will impact how I respond. Hi, Abel. How's Peru doing? Good to see you down there. So yeah, I'm just so you know, this is over here on this side is my that's where I can see the chat messages, and over here is for the technical side of things. So oh, I'm distracted now because Pastor Abel said hi. Hi. The pool of knowledge that we have, we know that we are impacted by our family of origin. So for instance, I know that what my parents did, the decisions they made, they impact me. So now we've taken it a step further a lot of times where this is not just counselors or psychologists or psychiatrists. This is actually most of us on the street. Most everybody is aware that if I'm having a serious problem, I might be able to trace it back to something in my childhood. And I might be able to say right here, this is the starting point. Maybe it was a traumatic event. Maybe it was something. And so we've become basically willing to self-diagnose a lot of things. And it's not all bad and it's not all good. There are some problems with it. One of the problems with it is that I can usually, if there's something negative in my life, if there's something happening in me, I can usually back up a bit and say, I think it comes from, and I can point to something in my past that someone else is responsible for. And so that can be, to borrow a term from our culture today, that can be toxic behavior, where every time something happens with me, I blame it on someone else, even if it's someone in the past. I blame it on them, because like the reason I'm like that is because, and I blame it back. And so when I'm talking about taking ownership, what I'm wanting to talk about is, how do I take responsibility for me? Because before God, when I'm standing before the judge of the whole earth at the end of all this, and I'm standing before Christ the King, the final judge, he's not going to ask me about my dad or my mom or my grandpa or some ancestor of mine. He's not going to ask me about someone else in my past and what they did. He's going to ask me about me and what I did with him. How did I respond to Christ? It's a big deal. So if when you read the scriptures, you discover that there is a lot of personal responsibility where you're responsible for you. And one example of this is in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel have this. Jeremiah, I think it's chapter 31. Yeah, Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 18 are very similar times, but two different prophets coming and speaking to the same people saying, hey, here's something from God that he wants you to know. So what is it? He says, you have a proverb. There's something you're saying in your culture. You're saying that, and here's the proverb, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. You can find an example of it in Jeremiah 31, verse 29. So the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And so what both Jeremiah and Ezekiel are telling them is, God wants to put this proverb to rest. This is not the way you're supposed to operate. He says, and he goes on, and literally they say, the soul who sins, that's the one who's going to pay for it. That's the one that will die. Not that the children are paying for the sins of their fathers. Because we'll say this sometimes. We'll say, that the children have, they're reaping the sins of their fathers. They're paying for the sins of their fathers. And there is some sense in which this is true, but I want us to be very careful, and here's why. Well, first, I need some coffee. The good part about going back and saying, the reason I am who I am is because of my parents and what they did, and my grandparents and what they did, the good part in this is I can see how God has been dealing with my family for several generations. And I can see the hand of God in this. And so I can look at it and say, wow, this is amazing. God is so faithful. The bad part, the challenging part, is if I go back and see what my parents did or my ancestors did, and then I say, man, they messed up my life. And so I will just sit down and be a victim because someone else did something that destroyed my life. That's the bad part of knowing that I can be hurt by things that happened in my childhood. So if, for instance, I say, why do I have this problem? Why do I have this? And it can be many things. Maybe it's as soon as a project that I'm working on gets underway and is like actually moving forward. This is true for me. Sometimes I will suddenly check out and I'll just be like, whoa, and I'll just stop working on it for a while. And I will just let it, and so I might say, why is this happening? Well, it's a problem, so I want to find out what's happening. So if I go back in my past and I'm able to say, right here, there's this and this and this. These are impacting me now. Okay, so if that's what's impacting me, let me see what I can do about that now to change that so that I don't have this problem of checking out every time I'm actually starting to see success in a project. Or it might be, there's many things, whether we have a problem with anger or lust or just in general depression, whatever it is, we can go back and we can find something and say, this is where it stems from. And I know that in my own life, there have been a few times. For instance, I had a question about my own self-image. And this was in my early 20s. I was trying to understand my own self-image. So this is the exercise that I went through. And I did this by myself. And then later, when I was speaking with a counselor, actually, we went back through some of this. So I started chasing down this sense of shame, this sense of not being good enough, this sense of insufficiency. And I started chasing it down. And I went all the way back, and I found several instances in my teens where things had happened, but all the way back to I think I was about 8 years old. And so here's the story. And I'm sharing it because when you hear it, you'll understand my point. Okay, so as an 8-year-old boy, my dad had a small engine shop out by the road, and so he had the Snap-on tool truck would come once a week, once every 2 weeks. I don't actually know when he came, but he came at least once a month. The Snap-on tool truck would stop by and see if Dad had any tools that needed to be warranted or if he needed to buy any new tools. And I think Dad would pay him, was making payments on these things. And so we would go into, and so think about it. Summertime, Tennessee, it's very hot outside. Snap-on tool truck drives up. The Snap-on tool truck has air conditioning on it. We don't have air conditioning in our house. We don't have air conditioning in the garage. We don't have air conditioning. We're Amish. And so you get on the Snap-on tool truck and it's cool in there. It's like the temperature is cold and all these tools. It's just really awesome. And so as a kid, I would love to get on the truck. Well, one day I was on the truck with my dad and the Snap-on tool truck. David Holland was the guy's name. And so David was saying, hey, talking to me, the little Amish boy, saying, hey, you want to sit in the driver's seat? And I was embarrassed. Honestly, the moment he looked at me and asked me if I wanted to sit in the driver's seat, I was entirely embarrassed. Too embarrassed to even think about sitting in the driver's seat. And so I just kind of went mute, like little Amish children can do. Like you have two settings. I could either overshare or I could be totally shy and be mute. That was the way I grew up. And so I went mute. And so I just stood there. And so then David Holland and my dad, they got off the truck and they were walking back into the garage, into the shop, my dad's shop. Well, right as they were walking in front, I suddenly, now that I was alone, had enough courage to hop into the driver's seat. So I slid into the driver's seat, and seeing my dad and David Holland walking right there in front, what do? I honk the horn. So I honk the horn. They jump, of course. They're startled, like they weren't expecting that. They're walking right in front of the vehicle. So I honk the horn, and then they look up, and my dad sees me sitting there. Well, somehow what I did embarrassed my dad. So he came back around inside, and he just grabbed me and said, don't do that. And he pulled me out. and we went back into the shop. But I was embarrassed now too, because my dad had just yanked me out and just pulled me out of the driver's seat and pulled me in there. And so I felt publicly humiliated because Dad did it right there in front of him. Now, I think Dad probably was also publicly humiliated because I did it right there in front of David Holland, you know? And so there was this moment here, and I don't know, you know, maybe my dad had to deal with that somewhere in his life. But for me, it was my authority figure being embarrassed by me and not dealing well with me and just yanking me out of there. I don't think Dad really thought about it ever again. I did. Not truly a lot, but there was that sense of shame that I came to be familiar with when I would do something stupid. And I actually traced it down to a few other instances, one before this time. This was a very strong one. There was one other time before this. So I had these moments in my life where I felt insufficient, where I felt I just felt ignorant. I just felt like I did the wrong thing. I always do the wrong thing, that kind of thing. And so this was following me down as I grew up, as I became an adult. I would still sometimes have this sense of just inferiority and insecurity and inability to do the right thing. And as a result, I would do that thing I did as a child. I'd just become mute. I'd just kind of fade away and shut up, and I wouldn't do the thing that God was calling me to do because I felt like I wasn't the one to do it. And so in my early 20s, when I wanted to deal with this scenario, I wanted to clear this. All it really took, actually, was I went back to that moment. I was thinking through that whole scenario with me coming out of that truck, with me going in there, and I just simply prayed a simple prayer and said, Lord, where were you when that was happening, and what did you think about it? And honestly, when I asked that question in prayer, I kind of chuckled because for the first time I saw the humor in the situation. Because first of all, David Holland didn't know what to do. My dad didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. We were three human beings on a journey together, and none of us really knew how to respond to the circumstances that presented themselves. And we didn't know how to respond to each other or whatever. So it was kind of humorous. And for the first time, I saw it completely differently, and the emotion actually was replaced to where right now, when I'm retelling you the story, I had to kind of work through, say, what were the emotions again? What was oh yes, the public humiliation, yes, okay, and I had to go find those again because they're not there anymore. They're not part of my life in that way. And so what happened in that time in my 20s, when I went back and I prayed about it and I said, Lord, where were you? What were you thinking? In reality, I wasn't being abused. I wasn't being hurt by my parent. There were so many things. It really was a golden childhood in so many ways, but I had this one moment. And so you might have a very traumatic time that something happened to you that was way more traumatic than honking the horn at the Snap-on guy and being pulled out of the truck by your dad. Or you might have something very small, like what mine was. The fact is that sense of insufficiency, that sense of public humiliation was enough to kind of squelch me and hold me back. And this is the important part, is that because of those sort of events in my life, the enemy could whisper in my ear and say, you're not enough. You always mess up. You probably shouldn't try doing anything because you're going to mess it up. And the enemy can stop me from being effective in my Christian ministry purely by some feelings that I had in the past that are no longer impacting me now. Well, they shouldn't be, but they are, because he keeps reminding me, remember what that felt like? Oh yeah, that was a bad feeling. And so he keeps trapping me. Okay, so in this scenario, and there's probably some counselor or psychologist or psychiatrist somewhere that will tell me that I'm oversimplifying things, but I think this is important. Oh, good afternoon from Austria. Awesome, thank you for joining in. So here's the simple application. I can choose to go back to that moment and sit in the humiliation of that and say, I can't believe my dad would do that to his kid. What kind of a dad would yank his son out of a truck? I can keep mulling over that and say, this is just a pattern. I see this all through my dad's life, and I can just keep going and going, and I can feel worse and worse about it. Or I can go back and say, Lord, what do you think? Where were you? And if it's a case of abuse, then you probably don't want to just sit by yourself and pray. You probably need to get someone, a counselor, to walk with you through this and make sure that you look into all the dark little crannies of your soul and see where all the hurt is, where all the lies are, and let the light of the truth of the love of God shine into your life and replace the brokenness and the hurt, and see what it's like to actually walk in the light of truth. So that's what was happening to me. I'm not pretending that I was abused or that, the trauma of my childhood was, I'm just telling you something simple impacted me for a long time, and I needed the light of Jesus to show in there. Here's the point, though, within today's thing. When I went back to that scenario, I had to stop thinking and acting and feeling like a victim and start saying, all right, well, that's what happened. That's what it felt like. But now what? And so I went looking for a higher authority than even myself. And I said, Lord, what do you think about this? And I applied his truth to my life, and it brought freedom. But the important thing to notice here is that I had a decision. When that feeling came along, I could either go back and be like, man, I was so dumb. And I'm telling you, the way our minds work, the way our heart works, the way our identity works, is we can remember what something feels like long after the event is over. And something can happen. We can be right back in that feeling. And we can be right back in that rejection, right back there in that moment. And we can be, if we're listening to the lies of the enemy will just reinforce, say, yeah, remember how you felt? You felt insufficient. Well, you are insufficient. Now, you know what? When the enemy whispers at me and says you're insufficient, I'm saying, of course I am. I'm a mere human. I'm just a man. But guess what? I am a child of the King. I'm a child of the Most High God, the creator of the universe. He is so sufficient. He is all sufficient. And I'm his child. So if you want to talk to me about this sufficiency thing, talk to my Father. He'll take care of you. And it's not a paralyzing factor in my life at this point. And honestly, this whole feeling of inferiority, I laugh about it a lot now, because one of the moments that had happened previously to this whole time with, one of the moments was that my sister and I, my family had borrowed a goat, and my sister and I were in charge of milking it. And I've told this story before, so you might have already heard it. But we were responsible for milking this goat. Well, so we go out there. So the first morning, I pour the feed in. I'm holding the goat there. My sister sits down. She's milking the goat. Well, she's a beginner milker, so it's very slow business. And so before she's finished milking, the goat is finished eating. So the moment the goat is finished eating, the goat is in a strange she's never been here before. She doesn't know what's going to happen next. So the goat is nervous, takes a side step, and I realized that if the goat moves, the milk pail might dump out. So I'm thinking, it's my responsibility to hold the goat. I got to do something. So I look around me, and so this is always the picture I always have. Here I am, a little Amish boy, got the wild Amish haircut, probably hasn't been combed in a couple days. Maybe it has. Anyway, and so I'm looking for, what can I do? I look back. Oh, there's some hay over there. So I hop over there. I grab the hay, and I throw it down in front of the goat. And it scares the goat. And the goat jumps and puts his leg in the bucket. And I just feel so insufficient, so humiliated, so stupid and ignorant. I don't know how to take care of a goat, right? So at the time, that was a bad memory. It was not one of the best moments of my life. Now, it's really quite hilarious to me when I think about how that all went down and how I responded to the goat. Because what would happen for the next, until I was in my 20s, the enemy could say, "Hey, remember how you messed up with that goat?" And I'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm kind of stupid, aren't I?" And I could literally I had a bad goat boy memory, right? Just because of something that happened. And so I'm using these examples because these aren't huge, deep, painful. They are just incidences. But I had to walk back to those and say, well, where was God in all this? What did he think? And I had to let the truth of God speak into the truth about me and the goat. Was I was a little Amish boy, and that was a quite honest mistake anyone could make with a goat. Goats are skittish and they're kind of stubborn, and it did not reflect on my character or my identity. It was just something that happened. Now that's what it is. But then it used to be a huge thing, part of my identity. I could mess things up like I did with the goat, like I did with the car horn and Snap-on truck, like I did. And I could go down the trail and remind myself of all the times that I had done these stupid things. And I could just confirm to myself how bad I was. But there came a day when I said, no, I'm done with that. I belong to Christ. And so I walked back down that trail, and everywhere along the trail I said, Lord, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Where were you in this circumstance? And the Lord revealed himself. So some of you that are listening probably had much more painful childhood trauma things than what I just described. But the illustration is, and this is where I want to make my application. See, the young men kept talking about Jocko Willink and his book, Extreme Ownership. So I finally got the book, Extreme Ownership, How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And so I got the book and I began reading it. So here's the scenario is within the military, and in this case they were in Iraq a lot of the time. But in the military, when you're given a position and a responsibility, you have other men underneath you, and there's always someone that you report to, and there's always someone that's reporting to you. And so when something goes wrong on the field, and you ask, hey, what was going on out there? You ask the people that are responsible, and if they say, oh, well, so-and-so couldn't get their stuff together and they didn't know what they were doing, and you just go down the line, you can pass out blame, and you might actually be accurate. You might be telling the truth and say, this is actually what happened. They didn't know how to use their equipment. They didn't know that there was bad communication over there. And you can pass the buck. The problem with that is, within the military structure, if you start passing the buck, instead of your superiors going, wow, that poor guy, he had inferior help, they just didn't do very well. Instead, they say, wow, that guy did not know how to train his people and make sure they do the right thing. We need to replace him. So you might think, I'm going to tell my superiors everything that my people below me did wrong so that I look better. But in the process of doing that, you actually look worse, because what they understand is that you are responsible for training and preparing and equipping everyone underneath you. So taking extreme ownership in the military means, in Jocko's words, or in the illustrations he gives in the book, and by the way, this book is not for everyone. It's got some strong stuff in it. These Navy SEALs, they are killers. That's what they do. And they are fighting for the United States of America. It's a whole different world than what some of you guys that I know live in. I thought there were things that I could understand and see and learn from them to be able to apply it in my life. And here is one of them. In my family, and this is true for many, many dads and husbands around the world, there are times when your wife and your children do things and you're like, I don't like what they're doing. And so next thing you know, I'm sitting alone in my basement. This is my basement, by the way. I'm sitting all alone going, man, I don't like the way my wife did that. I don't like what my children are doing. I don't like this. I don't like that. And we can complain and complain, and we can be the victim. And so when someone says, well, how's your family life going? You say, well, my wife this and my children that and blah, blah, blah. And, then I'm a pastor of a church. And so you ask me, how's it going? I'm like, well, it would be great except for the people. It's this, it's that. And you could just complain and pass the buck all the time. At some point, someone has to look at me and say, Joseph, you're responsible for what's happening. And I say, yeah, but I'm being a victim. Well, okay, stop for a moment. And so this is how I applied extreme ownership, or in this, what I call taking ownership here. taking ownership isn't saying it's all my fault, I'm a loser. That's not taking ownership. Taking ownership looks more like this. In the case of a Navy SEAL or whatever, they say, well, we had a communication breakdown, and so we lacked communication between this group and that group, and so we're working on how to repair that so that never happens again. I failed to instruct this group of people how to use this equipment, and so we're going to be going into training for the next 3 days to make sure that that never happens again. And so you're taking ownership of the solution. You might still be able to point out and say the problem was here, and they didn't know what they were doing, and so here's what we're going to do. So taking ownership isn't just saying, it's all my fault, it's me again, I was wrong, I'm dumb, that's not what taking ownership is. Because that's sometimes where we go with taking ownership, is we just think, I just have to always take the blame. It's not necessarily taking the blame. Taking ownership means I'm looking at the circumstance I'm finding myself in. I have identified the steps necessary to correct these things and to move forward, and I am doing my part to be part of the solution. And so in the case of my church, if I don't like the way, if there's problems in the church, I need to be talking with other church members. We need to be encouraging each other to pursue Jesus so that I don't ever again say, well, I'm doing great, but my church. No, it needs to be we, our fellowship. We together are striving toward Jesus to be able to become more like him and to do his mission. When I think about my family, instead of me going, oh, my wife this and my son that, I need to be able to say, well, my wife and I have been working through what breakfast time looks like. We've been working through what school is going to look like for our boys. When I talk about my children, I say, my sons and I, we've been discussing and we've been working through, and I've been training them on how they can clean up behind themselves so they can bring out the next set of toys without trashing the entire house multiple times a day. So we have been having a discussion and training and preparation for success. So I'm taking ownership, because who else is going to go pull all the boys together and say, listen, you've got awesome toys, and I'm glad you have them, and I want you to be able to use them. But right now, they're all out all the time, and that's not working, so we need to make a new strategy. What can we do? And they'll come up with a strategy, and they do. They're very helpful. They're like, well, we could always pick up these toys and put them back in the box before we get out those toys and start playing with them. That's a good idea. Let's do that. But that's me taking ownership. I wasn't the one who dragged the toys out in the living room in the first place. So I could pretend to be a victim, or I could be a victim and say, it's my boys, they always drag stuff out. Or I could be the solution. And that's what taking ownership is. So whether it's something that happened to me in my childhood, whether it's something that's happening to me now, the point is not that I am at fault for doing all the wrong things. The point is, I can actually take the lead in either finding healing for myself or alleviating the current circumstances wherever I find myself. So how can I take ownership and move forward to fix things so that I don't constantly find myself in a place where I want to pull the victim card? That's what taking ownership has meant to me. Before God, I'm not going to stand there and be able to say, well, I could have been a better dad except for my sons. Could have been a better pastor except for the people. I'm going to have to give an answer from me, my actions, and how I responded to Christ. And so I want to take ownership of that, and I can be part of the solution. Even if it wasn't truly my fault that the problem started, I can be part of the solution by saying, wow, my sons didn't know that it wasn't okay to do X, Y, and Z. And so now we're going to work on that, and I'm going to instruct them on X, Y, and Z so that they know. And then we're going to move forward from that. So those are my thoughts about taking ownership. And I'm already past 30 minutes. So that took a lot longer to set up and share than I thought it would. But thank you for joining me. I will see you guys next week. It's a blessing that before God, we can take ownership of our own lives. See ya.